We are happy to begin a new quarter this morning. If you look around, you might wonder where so-and-so or such and such is. They may be in another class, so don't worry about that just yet. Of course, if they don't come in the next hour, then you can check on them after that. But we have a lot of classes going on throughout the building, but thank you for being in this class. And it's already been announced, but you see it there on screen. We want to focus this quarter on our Sunday morning class here in the auditorium on focusing on God's heart, a study on forgiveness, focusing on God's heart. What kind of heart does God have? Certainly it's not a physical heart like ours, since He is a spirit being, we know that. But what is God's demeanor toward us? What is His posture toward us is really what we're going to be considering in this class. And if we understand forgiveness, then it will impact our lives, I think, in a number of positive ways. It will help us. It will diminish much of the worry and fear that often many of us struggle with on a, if not daily basis, at least a semi-regular basis. So how do we understand the heart of God? How do we understand forgiveness? This is just an outline of what I want to consider, and it really doesn't mean anything to you because you don't know what these titles mean, but just to show you what we're going to be studying. We're going to talk about the path to peace this morning. Next week, a snake that's gorgeous. You may say, what in the world's that about? Well, how we seek forgiveness, the forgiveness that we have sought through our lives. That's what we'll consider. Then we'll look at how forgiveness is shown by God, looking at the Old Testament coming up to the New Testament. DOA doesn't stand for what some of you medical people might think it stands for. It stands for the Day of Atonement. So that doesn't mean to be grim, but the Day of Atonement was, in one way, in the Old Testament history, a very grim day for the nation, but it had a great prospect of hope, looking forward, of course, to the arrival of Christ. We'll see how forgiveness is shown, especially through Jesus, and then how forgiveness can be seized. Either we accept or reject that great gift, and then we'll close by looking at the forgiveness that is seen in our lives. What difference does it make if God does forgive us? Do we keep that to ourselves? Do we just internalize it and don't allow it to make any sort of impact on our lives? I think you know already that certainly that's not the approach we should take, but that's what will take us through the end of March, the Lord willing. Here's the question I begin with this morning. I found this little picture that someone had drawn, and so I'm just lifting it from them and copying it. I like that. The question is one that you've maybe been asked or you've heard someone else ask, and most of us would have to answer in the affirmative. Do you have skeletons in your closet? That old idea that, somewhere back in the past, something that we did that we thought we had covered up and that no one would ever discover will be discovered. And, when I was a little guy, I remember, I guess I was a bit unusual, but I tried to keep up somewhat with national affairs and what was going on in the world. And I remember sometimes, especially in election years, there would be great talk about the political candidates and about his or her past and what they had done. And, there was sometimes some scandal that was brought up that might have been decades in the past, but somehow that, event way back when should still maybe disqualify the person from holding office at the present. And even this is kind of evolved now in the digital age. Now there is sometimes, every once in a while, it seems to be very selective. I'll just go ahead and throw that disclaimer out for you, at least in my estimation. Very selective that sometimes if there is an individual that they want to smear or get rid of or cancel, whatever term you want to use, they'll go back and they'll pull something out. And you see my tie this morning. Some of you know the name Casey Funderburg. If you don't know her name, she worked with the University of Tennessee in the athletic department in their digital media and their video productions, things like that. That's a big, of course, multi-million-dollar industry or enterprise, not just the football team, basketball, other athletic teams, but all of the support staff that work in that. And just to condense the story down to its very essence, she got into a Twitter spat argument with someone else. And they went back in her Twitter. Twitter is an online social media platform where you can just post whatever you're thinking about, whatever you want to think about. They went back and found a post from the time when she was 14, I think was the age. She was 14, now she's a decade older, 24 or something. And she had said something when she was 14. Now, All of my boys are past 14 now. Adam's a couple of years past that. The other's even farther. Most of you who are parents, you remember what your kids were like when they were 14. And especially if they've been 14 in the last few years, as they've tried to deal with this, social media world, the confusion that's there, just the silliness that characterizes a 14-year-old. I shudder to think if there would have been a camera trained on me as a 14-year-old, what it would have caught or observed or even heard. I'm not proud to say that, but we're just silly, we're immature. But needless to say, this particular little episode with Casey Funderburg, she had said something when she was 14 that would be considered today, if she had said it as a 24-year-old, completely off base, objectionable, offensive, whatever. And to save the firestorm, there's some debate about this. They didn't really release all of the details. She resigned her position. That was it. For something she said when she was 14. Now, that can be illustrated, that same sort of thing, all through the news cycles of the last few years. One of the things that I know White has been told, and Adrian and Anderson have been told, even about churches. As churches look for ministers or those that will serve on staff. Elders, and John can probably attest to this, some of the things that they are being told to do is go back through and comb through that social media of your potential candidate. And while we all like to have fun and goof off, and sometimes we say something without thinking, or sometimes we type something with our fingers or with our thumbs, and we hit send or we hit post, but then it's there. And you can say, I'm sorry, or I didn't mean to, or whatever, but sometimes it just stays out there forever, and it can have great residual impact on your career for decades. And so I say all of that to say, well, what does that have to do with this? Do we have skeletons in our closets? Well, all of us have things. And if you don't, please be brave enough to raise your hand, and I'll let you teach and I'll sit down. If you're brave enough to say, I've never done anything in my entire life that I'm ashamed of. There's never been a time when I've misbehaved or I've said something in anger or I've responded without you're not going to say that, are you? You're not going to affirm that. Because I know, like me, you too, have done things and said things and even thought things that are not what they should be. Well, what does that do? What does that realization do? What it could do is just say, well, we're all in the same boat, so it doesn't matter. But we know, being informed by Scripture, that leaves us then in a position of need. And it leaves us with a position of, want. How can I, if you will, get rid of that? Now, in one sense, that skeleton might remain in the sense the residual, again, remaining memory of it. Whatever I did, I know I shouldn't have done it, but I've made it right, or I've tried my best to make it right. And the person, that I might have even sinned against or that I hurt in some way, they've forgiven me. I realize that hurt can remain, and that scar, if you will never fade away completely. But still, we need to do something with it. And so that's where we come to the idea of what do we do with forgiveness. That's really the heart of forgiveness, that there are things that I've done, things that I know I should not have done, things that have been in contradiction to what God desires from my life, things that I've done that have hurt other people, that have broken those relationships, whatever it is. And it'll apply universally. The unique and specific details will be yours for your own life to recall, but we all know those skeletons are there. Well, what we are really looking for, of course, is peace in this process. And all of you that have listened to me at any length, preaching or teaching, know that President Lincoln is probably my favorite, at least biographical study as it regards our presidents. And I've considered his life from a number of different angles, and a lot of different authors and researchers, of course, have helped me in supplying that information just for my consumption. But the big question, of course, when President Lincoln was reelected was, what would he do with the southern states? What would he do with the Confederacy? And he had a number of advisors that gave him a number of approaches to take, some of them very severe and retaliatory and punitive in what they thought President Lincoln should do, but he adopted a different approach. And this comes straight out of his second inaugural address on March the 4th, 1865. He said, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." Those words are very weighty, and especially given the context in which they were spoken. They're eloquent and articulate, but they beautifully describe how President Lincoln did, in fact, guide the nation from its fractured state back to a united group of states, if you will. And I know we can debate a lot of that historically, if you will, but that word that stands there toward the bottom, a just and a lasting peace, that's really what forgiveness is seeking to obtain. And that's the desire that we have for forgiveness, because peace, we mentioned a couple of weeks ago when we were thinking about the holiday season, the announcement that was made when Jesus was born by those angels to the shepherds, peace, peace. And even today, that word is so significant from its biblical usage that it carries down even into modern times. In the Hebrew language, and even among Jewish people today, they will greet one another by the Hebrew word for peace, shalom. And that was the common greeting both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. You remember Paul will begin many of his letters by saying grace and peace. Grace is a Greek word, charis, that means favor and things like that. Peace is the Hebrew word shalom, and it really encompasses a totality of one's not just my attitude, my mindset, my thinking processes. It includes my physical health. It includes my financial well-being. It encompasses all of life. And so what they were doing by merely uttering that word peace is that they were, as it were, asking God, even as they greeted one another, that they would have that sort of peace, that sort of tranquility, that sort of blessing, that sort of just desire that all of us have even now, centuries later, for things to be well with us. And certainly that's what forgiveness again is going toward, or at least trying to get at. I want to take you through the Old Testament this morning. I love words. Those of you again that have listened to any lesson that I've presented or even a class know that I love words. And so I want to take you through the Old Testament and look at the words that the Old Testament uses this morning for peace, and notice just some different aspects of this word, I said for peace, for forgiveness. We're going to look at the Old Testament words for forgiveness this morning, and there's more than just one, so that we can try to get kind of a broad, if you will, view of what in the Old Testament these people would have understood when they heard the word forgiveness, or when they heard it promised, or when they were told this is how you obtain it. And this is comparative in my mind to how you might just take the image I always have is of some sort of precious jewel. Now, this might be depicted on a television program. I don't know that any of us have a diamond large enough to hold in our hand. You know, most of them, you ladies have a few on your fingers, and whatever size it is, you can probably hold it fairly comfortably between two fingers, right? You can't hold up a diamond, and need your entire palm. But imagine you could. What you can do, though, with that precious stone is you can turn it. And as the light catches it from different angles, the light is bent or refracted. That's what gives you that sparkle. And so that's what the jewelry commercials want to do. They put a precious stone, they put it on a little carousel of sorts, and they'll shine a bright light on it. And so when it turns, it sparkles. And that light is bent and refracted in all of these different sorts of ways. That's kind of what I imagine, at least I'm trying to make as my attempt with taking God's Word and just kind of holding it up and turning it and looking at it from every different angle as to how God's Word, especially this morning in the Old Testament, describes forgiveness. So let's do that. You don't have to remember these words, but just to give them to you there in their Hebrew form. Silakah is the Hebrew word for forgiveness, and it is a word that appears 3 times. Now you may think, well, surely it appears more times than that, but this is the term translated for forgiveness in its adverbial form that it's telling us with God. For instance, Psalm 130 and verse number 4, these 3 instances. I said adverb, I meant noun, excuse me. There is forgiveness with you, the psalmist said, with God. there is forgiveness with you. You're the source. You're the one that we must go to if forgiveness is to be found. And then he adds, it's very curious, that you may be feared. There is forgiveness with you that you may be feared. Now, I didn't tell you at the start, but I hope you know already. If you have a question or a comment or want to inject something, please just get my attention. That's sometimes hard to do. Throw a songbook at me or whatever you need to try to get me to pause for a moment, and I'll try to do that. But your feedback's welcome. What do you think he means? Or what do you think the import of that idea is? There is forgiveness with you that you may be feared. If you're dealing with a person, and I guess the easiest way to illustrate it somewhat might be our criminal justice system. It once was the case, again, that crime was punished. Now, again, there can be a big soapbox over here, and I'm tempted to jump on it, but I'm not. But just looking culturally today, in many cases, it seems like there's not any longer a great deal of fear in the minds of criminals or those who would break the law as to their being punished. Perpetrators, if they're punished at all, seem to be punished very lightly, and that's across the board for any number of different criminal offenses. But if you were, brought before a judge or jury, and you knew that your fate, rested in their hands, there would be some trepidation there. There would have to be some natural anxiety, perhaps. And so Psalm 130, I think the psalmist is asking us to consider, God, there is forgiveness with you that you may be feared. We reverence God. We stand in awe of God. We submit to God because we understand He's the one that we are really dealing with, and He's the one that will pronounce either that guilty or innocent verdict, if you will. The word appears in Daniel 9, verse 9. Daniel praying, he said, to the Lord our God belong mercy and forgiveness, though we have rebelled against Him. This idea that it's God Himself. And that's really an important primary consideration, that forgiveness is with God. That is, that's where it must ultimately not just start, if you will, in the sense of it comes from God to us, but it starts with us going to God in order to seek it. Nehemiah chapter 9, the people returned from captivity. They have been there in captivity. They have been punished. The homeland has been decimated. Now Ezra and Nehemiah, Zerubbabel, these guys, they're trying to restart, if you will, worship to God, restore society to what God intended for it to be. And they will often make appeal back to the fact of, we're in this spot, we're in this terrible shape because of how we did disobey the will of God. We turned away from Him. And so forgiveness is exactly what we need, and only He can give it. You are God, ready to pardon, gracious and merciful, slow to anger, abundant in kindness, and you did not forsake them. They're even looking back at how the nation had been treated historically and recognized that God had, even in the way that He had allowed their enemies to defeat them, was still merciful, even though they had suffered so much. Absolutely. The consequences for their actions. And so that's going to be something kind of, as we've said, we know instinctively, intuitively, however you prefer to understand it, that when I do wrong, there's a consequence. That's, again, if we're going to talk about cultural issues today, we've tried to separate that idea of responsibility for action, that there is punishment for crime or disobedience or law breaking, as the case may be. And yet we know, even by the way God has made us and by the record of history itself, by what the Word of God teaches, that punishment does come. And so that avoidance or that forgiveness, that release from that punishment is what we're so desperately seeking. There's another word, it's similar to that, salakah, that also means to forgive, to pardon, or to spare. This term is found 46 times in the Old Testament, so it's much more common. That doesn't mean it's more important, but just to show you it's a more commonly used word. It's found 20 times in the books of Moses, the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So Moses used it as a favorite one of his. Of interest, this word always has God as its subject. That is, God is the one forgiving. God is the one forgiving. He is the one who it ultimately, rises or falls with. We may deceive ourselves into thinking that I can, sometimes we even use language like that. This is going to be later on the study this morning, just kind of introductory, preliminary. We use language like, well, you just have to forgive yourself. Is that true? Is that, even a valid notion or idea? Well, it can be. And we'll talk about kind of psychologically that construct that there are times when, as it were, we might struggle to forgive ourselves. And really, it's not a matter of forgiving ourselves. It's rather a matter of accepting the forgiveness of God. But again, that'll be later on in the quarter. We might sometimes say, well, they forgave me, and talk about, I made amends with some other individual. If there was some sort of disagreement that we had, we've restored, we've made conciliation in the animosity that was between us. So now we're back on good terms. And we may leave God out of the equation. And God may have us do those things that I've talked about, but still, have we made it right with Him? Have we really sought forgiveness by doing what He said? Here's a few places where this word is used. Exodus 34 and verse 9, Moses praying on behalf of himself and the people. He's really remarkable, Moses is, because when the people disobey God on a couple of different occasions, says, Moses, just get out of the way and I'll zap them. Zap them is that technical term for just wiping them out, okay? He said, Moses, I'll start again. I'll make a new nation out of you. Moses, amazingly, to his credit, says, no, don't do that. Now, again, it's not a matter that Moses coerced or manipulated or changed the will of God. God knew what He was going to do. He even knew the response Moses was going to make. That's, again, kind of beyond our human reasoning capability to work through matters such as this, but these are illustrative. Moses praying to the people, and he said, no, God, if I have found grace in your sight, O Lord, let my Lord, I pray, go among us, even though we are a stiff-necked people, and pardon, there's the word, pardon or forgive our iniquity and our sin, and take us as your inheritance. Yes, we're foolish. Yes, we're stiff-necked. We're stubborn. We're hard-headed. And interestingly, even though he was speaking it about his own race of people, his own nation of people, those descendants of Abraham who came out of Egypt, all of us this morning would put ourselves right in the same category. We still are stiff-necked, stubborn people. We still need God's pardon, and we still want Him to be our God. Another word, looks like NASA, Brother Clyde, but it's actually nasa. This word is a basic word that means to lift, to bear up, to carry, to take away, as it were, to forgive, to pardon. And that word is beautifully used in a number of places. Numbers chapter 14, again, Moses is praying, and he's really here announcing to the people what they should already know, that the Lord is long-suffering and abundant in mercy, forgiving iniquity and transgressions. Now here he does, as he does a couple of other places in the Pentateuch, give yet a reminder. But He, God, by no means clears the guilty. Forgiveness is not just a refusal to acknowledge what has happened. It's something more than that, something even more beautiful than that. God will not clear the guilty. He'll visit the iniquity on the fathers on the children to the third and fourth generation. And we often struggle with understanding, well, how does my sin, does it just impact me or does it impact others? Well, the answer is yes, it does both. Am I responsible for my sins, or am I also responsible for, if I, as it were, inherited sin from others? Of course, this begins to interweave with a lot of other false ideas. Original sin from Catholicism, inherent total depravity from Calvinism. All of those things we'll maybe consider in greater detail in future lessons, but it's my sin that separates me from God, but at the same time, my sin can have an impact and influence other people and situations. Yes, and thank you for that word. That's the word I needed to use, Doug. The consequences of my sin. Sometimes we refer to generational cycles. Those that work in the field of public education. I know we talked about this in our parenting class, and I talked with some of our young teachers, and they say, you can just see it in the lives of children who are in a home where their parents are absent, or we'll just say it gently, they're not what they should be. And the child suffers as a result. You've all seen that. And what's sad is that sometimes that's generational. Those who are parents now suffered in the home of their parents who were not what they should be. And it just kind of rolls down through the years to the third and fourth generation. There are cycles, if you will. And so that, like Doug said, is exactly right. This generational sin, whatever it is, if that's a history, for instance, you could talk about a history of drug and alcohol abuse and how that can just kind of permeate. Now, each individual, for sure, has to make the decision for himself or herself what they'll do, and they reach an age where they're responsible for what they do, but still that impact of the influence and the example that was set before them can often have long-term ramifications and very serious consequences. Here's another word. Like we said, we're just holding up the word. We're turning it in every direction just to see it. I hope you're beginning to see, forgiveness. It's a multifaceted word. It's beautiful from whatever angle you consider it. This word is interesting, kafar. It means to cover, to purge, to make atonement, to make reconciliation. Now, there in the parenthetical definition I give you, to cover with pitch. Now, you may say, well, what do you mean cover with pitch? You're talking about baseball? You remember back when God told Noah to build the ark? He gave him the dimensions, so wide, so tall, so long. And then what did he say to do on the outside? Cover it with pitch. Now, pitch is an old word. Again, we're thinking of a baseball term, but probably pitch, some of the newer versions will use a big fancy technical word like bitumen, but it was probably something like tar or asphalt, some petroleum product you can think of if you've stained a deck or you put some kind of sealer on wood, or even today we can put it on concrete and other materials too. But it was intended, of course, to make the ark watertight, or to help it be watertight, protect it from the the storm that it would be in. So cover over. Now you may say, well, what in the world does making the ark waterproof have to do with forgiveness? Well, in the book of Leviticus especially, this is where the word appears more often than anywhere else. And Leviticus 16 is actually the chapter where it appears more than any time else. And we'll talk about that later. I told you we were going to talk about the Day of Atonement. That's where we'll look at it in great detail. But if you go to the book of Leviticus, some people call this book the Holiness Code. The Holiness Code. And by that, God is saying the purpose of me giving you my law is this. You are to live distinct, separate lives from the nations around you. Your behavior should be observably different than those around you, because you're my people and I'm your God. In the book of Leviticus, the word will be most often, and I think there might be an exception or two, but very few, that the word atonement is used here. And you might remember back last year, I can say last year now, in 2022, one of our big words that we studied on Sunday night, whatever month that was, I don't even remember, was the word atonement. It's not a word that we just go around, throwing out in day-to-day conversation. Atonement, what does that really mean? Leviticus 4 verse 20, talking about the work that the priest would do. The priest would take the bull as a sin offering, and he would offer it to God, and the priest would make atonement for them, and it shall be forgiven them. And this idea of covering that we'll see in Leviticus chapter 16 to cover will involve the Ark of the Covenant. And if you remember the Indiana Jones movie, that gold box with the angel wings on top of it, inside was the law of God, but blood would be sprinkled on the top of that golden box. And that place where the top of that box, that Ark of the Covenant, was called the mercy seat. And it would be covered with blood. The thought is, even though the Bible never explicitly says this in word-for-word fashion, the thought is that we have kind of deduced, and through centuries men have reached the same conclusion, is that that covering of blood, as it were, represented God looking down from heaven, and instead of seeing His law on the Ark of the Covenant, what did He see? The blood. He saw that someone or something, in this case the animal, had suffered for the consequences of violation of that law. Now, of course, I'm giving you the whole quarter in one class this morning, but just to show you where we're going, Fast forward to the New Testament and we see Jesus as the Lamb of God. We see Him dying on the cross. We see Him shedding His blood. And if I cover myself with His blood, the New Testament tells me how to do that. When God looks down from heaven, instead of seeing His law, my violation and sin concerning it, He sees what? He sees His blood. That's a beautiful picture, isn't it? The Passover, the same way, kind of all of those images, those types and antitypes, we sometimes call them, from the Old Testament help us understand just how beautiful forgiveness is. So kafar, it means to make a covering, to make an atonement for. And that. Did you say something? Yes. Okay. Sure. Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. They would go out and rather than take the rail off, they would sometimes with new defenses. They would take the railroad, they would not take the railroad off. They would simply go out and spray block out the defense. And that's a perfect picture. Yeah. Yeah, that's a beautiful example. If you couldn't hear, Brother Dennis was telling us about a railroad tie and how it's covered with this pitch and tar, and making the comparison, the analogy to what the blood of Christ does for us. And I think that's a good one indeed. If you go to Psalm 51, this is the last set of scriptures we'll look at this morning. Psalm 51, most recall King David's great sin with Bathsheba. And, that sordid affair. Sounds like something straight out of Hollywood today. If you read the backstory, and David, like any good political leader, and I'm using good there, tongue-in-cheek, even today say, well, I've got to keep this scandal from getting out. So he has Uriah killed after Uriah would not comply and trying to help David cover up his sin. And, it seems at the end of the day, David kind of sits back and says, well, I did it. Good job me. Patting himself on the back. Nathan the prophet shows up in 2 Samuel 11, tells him such a story that David said a man that would do such things as that concerning just animals needs to die. And Nathan says, David, you're the guy. You're the man that needs to die. But God's going to pardon you, and there's a whole other set of circumstances and consequences that result from that sin. But David, to his credit, prays. And Psalm 51 is sometimes called the lament of a broken heart. If you've not read Psalm 51 lately, I'd encourage you to do that. If you've not prayed it lately, I'd encourage you to do that. Now, I'm not saying you've done something as egregious as David did, but I know that there have been times in my life when I've sought forgiveness, and sometimes the words were hard to find. You can pray. You can put yourself in David's shoes, as it were, even though you may not be guilty of the same transgressions as was he, and pray. And Psalm 51 will help you do that. And so what does David do in his prayer to God in this chapter? I won't give you the Hebrew words. If you're interested in them, I can supply them to you later. But here's what David asked. He asked God, blot out. Blot out. Ladies, you know this better than us guys. When we go to lunch and I get a big salsa stain right there, what's Amy going to do when she gets home? I hope. She's going to blot it out, right? There's going to be a little stain stick and some other little tricks that she uses in the funeral home. You learn a lot of these. I actually know some of them. I rarely do them. But, you blot it out. There's a stain there, but it's going to be removed through some effort. David is asking God, blot out. Blot out my transgressions. He asked God in verse 2 and verse 7, wash. What a simple metaphor. Yeah, he needed to be clean. Sin makes us dirty. We all need to be clean. I love how as that relates especially to baptism in the New Testament. The picture is so clear, and people today that say, baptism, it's not necessary, and it's so clear that it is just from this simple analogy that he makes. And I love Brother Keeble talking about, the soap. A woman doesn't wash clothes without soap in the water, and you have to be in the water where the blood of Christ is to be clean. He makes that articulated so beautifully and powerfully, I can't imitate it. Number 3, cleanse, also from verse 2, the same idea. Cleanse, I'm dirty. Purge, Psalm 51, verse 7. He's asking God. David says, purge me with hyssop. Hyssop was, that plant that they would use kind of for a disinfectant purpose. And he knew that he needed that in his life. And then he says, hide. Take it out of sight. I don't want to see it anymore. And God, I don't want it to be in your sight anymore as a sinner. I want you to hide my sin away from our notice or our observation. Hide your face from my sins. And so that's forgiveness. And if I appreciate what forgiveness is, I have to understand what sin does. It makes me dirty. It separates me from God. And so I need that forgiveness so very desperately. And so do you. Whittier said in one of his verses, drop thy still dews of quietness till all our striving cease. Take from our souls the strain and stress, and let our ordered lives confess the beauty of thy peace. And that's a plea for forgiveness. And our overview of these terms simply brings out those key concepts that when sin defiles and deserves punishment and severs the relationship I have with God and makes me dirty, I need forgiveness. I need peace. And only God can provide that. Now, again, of course, we're talking about and going to ultimately end up with Jesus. And that's where we know we're going. But even in the Old Testament, I hope you appreciate maybe in a little better way, a little deeper way this morning, how those people would have also appreciated that fact. We live in times where maybe this message, we're afraid to share it in one sense. We're afraid of that idea of being labeled as intolerant or judgmental or offensive or whatever. But, we don't really take that same approach across the board. We would be outraged, and we would even demand, action be taken against a physician if, we went to him or her and we were having some difficulty and they did a scan or they ran a test or they saw without any doubt whatsoever, that we had a problem. There was a blockage, there was a tumor, there was, some abnormality there. And if all they did when they come in the exam room was saying, you'll be all right, don't worry about it, and patted us on the back, we'd be outraged when we found out differently. Our family, if it cost us our life, would sue for malpractice. You knew there was a problem, and you knew a solution, and you did nothing about it. And that's the condition of the world, really, isn't it? And I need to be, I know I'm preaching to myself here, I need to be more bold in telling people that you've got a problem. I've got a problem too, but we have the answer, and it's Jesus. Well, that's our time for this morning. Do you have a question or an observation you'd like to make in the last couple of minutes?
You mentioned there where it talks about God visiting iniquity. That sounds a little odd to our ears. You see that several places. One, where we call it the Ten Commandments.
Mm-hmm.
God talking about idolatry. He says, I'm a jealous God, visiting iniquity of the fathers on the children of the first, third, and fourth generation of those who hate me. He goes on to say, showing mercy to thousands, to those who love me and keep my commandments. He says, you think that's really nice? That's thousands of people. But that's not what that means.
Right.
The verse I can prove that to you, I think, is over in Deuteronomy 7:9. I've got that written down in my margin. Which that verse says, therefore know that the Lord your God, He is God, the faithful God, who keeps covenant and mercy for 1,000 generations with those who love Him and keep His commandments. It's not thousands of people there in Exodus 20, but thousands of generations.
Right. And the way in which He operates toward us and His forgiveness. Well, thank you for a wonderful study this morning, your participation in it. Next week, we'll continue. We'll talk about a gorgeous snake, kind of in quotation marks there, but looking into the heart of God, into forgiveness. Thank you for being here this morning.